November 2017 is a great month if you love Marvel or DC comic heroes. On November 3rd, Thor Ragnarok releases, then a couple weeks later, on November 17th, both Justice League and Netflix's Punisher series debut, and that's before getting into all the TV offerings well underway like the CW's Flash and Arrow. It's a super dense month, and there's something for fans of either of the big two to enjoy. Now, I'm pretty excited for both Thor Ragnarok and Justice League. As of recording this video, I haven't seen Justice League, but it looks like DC might be starting to hit their stride in their own cinematic universe, and I enjoyed Taika Waititi's take on the God of Thunder, but only after I watched it for the second time. It wasn't until my sister took me to watch Thor Ragnarok again that I understood how to calibrate my expectations for comic book films. To use a music analogy, I was thinking about Marvel and DC movies as film covers of comic stories, but instead I should start thinking of them more as the equivalent of mashups or remixes of comic issues. See, to get prepared for Ragnarok, I decided to read up on some Thor comics for the first time. In particular, I started with Walt Simonson's run of The Mighty Thor, a bombastic run that introduces Beta Ray Bill, the entire world getting covered in ice, and the Avengers fighting alongside every Viking in Valhalla to prevent Ragnarok. I had a lot of fun reading on the character that I previously only experienced in movies, cartoons, and video games, and I also read Planet Hulk, which was previously experienced in an animated movie. I was excited to see what I've read get adapted in the same way that Harry Potter got adapted to the silver screen. But then I watched both Thor Ragnarok and Batman v Superman for the first time this month and came away feeling a little bit cold on both films. Dawn Adjusted had some structural issues, and no doubt that contributed to it, but I would never have shaken the feeling that the whole was kind of less than its parts. Thor Ragnarok, for all its fun pacing and humor, felt a bit similar, as though each fraction of a storyline would have been better served as a more complete film on its own. Planet Hulk, The Dark Knight Returns, or any of the Avengers issues with the Grandmasters would make a great story to adapt, and I felt like Ragnarok and BVS closed the door on potential adaptations for these stories in the future. However, when I saw Thor Ragnarok a second time with my sister, things began to better fall into place. Part of that was, of course, the venue provided a more enjoyable experience, but the lion's share came from how my sister reacted to the Frankenstein storyline of the film. She liked it a lot and loved seeing the Hulk show up in a surprise supporting role. See, both my sister and I are caught up on the MCU, but unlike me, she wasn't burdened by a canon of existing comic storylines and could enjoy the film on its own merits without comparing it to the ideal film or films I might have had in my head. And upon further reflection, I realized that my perspective was nonsense. While a full-fledged Death of Superman or Planet Hulk film might have been better than the mashup films we ended up getting, it's just as likely that their more straightforward adaptations would have lacked the resonance of their original comic runs. There's a laundry list of bad, straightforward adaptations both in and outside the superhero genre, so holding it against Thor Ragnarok or Batman v Superman or Justice League, when I finally do get around to watching it, that they didn't do to their source material what the film adaptations did to Harry Potter, is to unnecessarily enforce a rigid perspective on how comic book movies should be made, especially since comic book movies never really held themselves to that standard. See, prior to the breakout success of the MCU, the superhero genre didn't really confine itself to its source material almost at all. Just look at Batman. Adam West's initial adaptation tried to faithfully replicate the aesthetic of the comic, but had such a drastically different tone and story that it prompted fan backlash. The Tim Burton film took the characters that we all know from the comics and threw them in an entirely new story in a Gotham filled with Gothic architectures. And that's before we get into the cartoons, which didn't really start doing straightforward comic line adaptations until about 2007. And somehow I had this idea stuck in my head that Marvel and DC were doing something analogous to what Peter Jackson did to The Lord of the Rings, and I think I have mostly myself to blame. See, I was always a casual comics fan, reading the occasional trade while waiting for my mom to finish shopping at Barnes & Noble's. On top of that, the early days of the MCU were so focused on origin stories and laying character groundwork that I never realized the remix and matchup nature of the films. Iron Man, Thor, and Captain America each hit on the broad strokes of each hero's origin, and I didn't know the history of each character to notice that Donald Blake was supposed to be Thor's alter ego, or that Obadiah Stane wasn't the original mastermind behind Tony's accident in the desert. Then you couple that with Marvel's tendency to use subtitles based on well-known storylines, and suddenly a switch was flipped. I stopped looking at the MCU and DC's equivalent as franchises independent of their original work, and instead saw them as expansions of the comics themselves, and expected them to more strictly follow their advertised story arcs. Of course, not only is this an unfair standard to place on a film, it's also creatively stifling, and penalizes the superhero genre for leaning in on one of its strengths, the ability to mix and match over half a century of comic issues in entirely unique and new storylines. This mashup narrative potential doesn't preclude the ability for straightforward adaptations either. If you just look at DC's current run of animated movies, you'll see a whole slew of attempts at everything from The Killing Joke to even more obscure affairs like Batman and Son. This mashup ethos also opens potential for some wonderful surprises, and the best example of the unexpected potential is the character Korg from Thor Ragnarok. Alright, so in Planet Hulk, Korg is introduced as another gladiator stranded on Sakaar. He has a stoic disposition, he acts as additional invulnerable muscle for the group, and tries to be a bit of a moral center for Hulk gang of gladiator revolutionary. However, he's a bit of an unremarkable character though, since he's basically the Thing if you stripped out the character's catchphrase and New York roots. In Ragnarok, however, Korg is a radically different character, which you can see in the following clip that I edited a bit in a weak attempt to avoid copyright claims.
Hey, take it easy, man. Over here, there's a pile of rocks waving at you. Here. Yeah, I'm actually a thing. I'm a being. Allow me to introduce myself. My name is Korg. I'm kind of like the leader in here. I'm made of rocks, as you can see, but don't let that intimidate you. You don't need to be afraid unless you're made of scissors. Just a little rock, paper, scissors joke for you. This is my very good friend over here, Meek. He's an insect and has knives for hands.
You're a Cronin, aren't you?
That I am.
How'd you end up in here?
Oh, well, I tried to start a revolution, but didn't print enough pamphlets, so hardly anyone turned up, except for my mum and her boyfriend, who I hate. As punishment, I was forced to be in here and become a gladiator. Bit of a promotional disaster, that one. But I'm actually organising another revolution. I don't know if you'd be interested in something like that. Do you reckon you'd be interested? This whole thing is a circle. But not a real circle, more like a freaky circle.
This doesn't make any sense.
Nah, nothing makes sense here, man. The only thing that does make sense is that nothing makes sense.
This departure works much better for the film's tone and makes Korg better stand out from the other big muscle, big fighter characters like Hulk, Drax, or The Thing. Korg was one of, if not my favorite character in the film, and he was only made possible by the willingness of Taika Waititi to take a chance and depart heavily from the character's comic presentation, to hold other changes against the film because they were less faithful as an adaptation, rather than a technical or narrative problem, would also just be bad criticism. Now, don't get me wrong, that doesn't mean every film suddenly gets a pass on every change they make when pulling from previously existing work. Just that the execution of an adaptation, particularly in the comic book superhero genre, shouldn't be measured for or against the film, but should instead be its own focus of analysis. Hell, at some point I'm probably going to pick a movie like Age of Ultron, Justice League, or Civil War and compare their comic source material. Civil War in particular is interesting to me because of how different the film took the plot and character beats from both storylines while still executing on the central premise. Superheroes getting into an argument and punching each other. Of course, this is all just one way to look at superhero films. While I can't stop anyone from being upset that we're not getting the frame-for-frame recreation of For the Man Who Has Everything, I do recommend taking a step back from thinking so narrowly about adaptations and just come along for this mashed up and remixed ride. So what do you think? Should we be stricter on our demands for storyline adaptations? What story mashups would you like to see make it to the silver screen? Can Superman break vibranium? Leave a comment below or join the conversation on Reddit, and thanks for watching.